You might not be aware of how contentious the definition of terrorism is, or maybe you are, and you're watching this because you're curious about the opinion of a random stranger on the internet. When we do the very cliché thing of looking at its definition, as presented by Search.com, we can see multiple quite different definitions. Here it's written that it's being done by non-state actors and inflicted upon civilians so that they pressure the governments. We have another one that is it's being done by state actors in order to control their own population, or that is broad use against everyone for any kind of goal. These definitions are obviously pretty vague and somewhat mutually exclusive, and now that we're aware of this, we can take a look at how they're used right now. For this, I will take a bit of a detour and look at some of the history of Ireland, which historically, and up to this day, is dominated by Great Britain, as an example of the way in which Britain is still an occupying force, or at least an oppressive force. I will mention things like involuntary ground rents, which, while not all that high, still are unjust and anachronistic remnants of the British taking something that didn't belong to them. Another sign of this kind of dominance would be British ownership over a port like
Rosslare.
And while your more obvious forms of occupation are in the not all that distant past, there are still many people who are aware of the way that their people have historically been treated, and who are therefore more aware and more understanding of things happening to other people that are similar to what happened to them. Which brings me to how this connects to terrorism. Almost a century ago, the suffering of the Palestinians started at the hands of the back then recent Zionist settlers who committed all types of atrocities against the people living on the land prior to their arrival. After the attacks on mostly military installations that were carried out by Hamas on October 7th, during which they took settlers and military personnel captive, there was an increase in violence used against the civilian population that consisted mostly of displaced people located in the Gaza Strip. While this modern phase of the conflict has been widely accepted as being a genocide, almost all governments, and especially those of the Western Bloc, have failed to step in to stop Israel from continuing its slaughter. So when we have a population like the Irish, who are very aware of the injustices that they have as a group experienced, it is only natural that resistance groups form, who make it their goal to change the approach of their government towards the injustices being perpetrated and hinder the efforts of other involved parties in the extermination of the people. One of the organizations that formed in response to the heightened violence was the group Palestine Action, which was based in Britain until the forced disillusionment caused by them being designated as a terrorist group, which brings us back to the very beginning. I firmly believe that this is a perfect example of how most designations of terrorist groups are only ever done as to support some ulterior motive and not actually to protect people. This can be seen by the contrast between how governments treat different groups. Palestine Action, who are a civil disobedience group who are focused on property and infrastructure damage, as well as disruptive protests, who are, as before described, prescribed as a terrorist organization, despite overwhelmingly not fitting the description of one, since they had neither striking fear nor harming people as goals of their activism. While there are signs of this designation potentially being appealed and reversed, the possibility of laws being used in this way at all is worrying enough. On the other hand, we have people being allowed to publicly and legally support the even under the ineffective international law criminal actions of a state like Israel, whose actions would be classed as terror if they weren't a government. An interesting side note to this example is that the Israeli military itself is conformed of multiple different terrorist groups, like the Haganah, the Irgun, and Lehi, who are responsible for many massacres and displacements of the Palestinian population, as well as bombings targeting the British presence in Palestine, who are also kind of occupying it. The conduct of the IOF, or yes, it's officially known IDF, but it's an occupation force, not a defense force, has not strayed very far from its roots, as it's obvious when you take a look at the mountain of evidence of soldiers filming themselves committing war crimes because they are so proud of their actions.
Through Khan Yunis, and we were stopped over here because behind us they set charges and they're about to blow up 4 houses. Saw those houses being blown up over here in the back in Khan Yunis. Wow, that's all I can say.
This doesn't seem all that different to what we are constantly being told about other groups who are supposedly the scum of the earth, but when our geopolitical allies or our militaries themselves do those things, we see them as acceptable despite them being just as inhumane. If the preservation of innocent lives was actually something that our governments were concerned about, then they would not apply this double standard wherever possible. This leads me to conclude that the modern day use of the term terrorism is, at least at times, nothing more than an attempt to remove a group that are too effective at potentially causing change for the better. While this obviously doesn't mean that every designated group is automatically comprised of saints only, it does mean that you should judge groups on the morality of their actions and beliefs and not on their governmental designation. The only thing that we are missing now is an understanding of why our governments behave in these transparently unethical ways, which, where complex, can be generalized to get the broader points across as follows. There are often strong lobbies who benefit handsomely from these kinds of crimes, like the military equipment lobbies, or specific lobbies like Kufi or Labour Friends of Israel, who bribe officials in order to get their way. Sometimes a government doesn't even have to be lobbied in order for them to do a specific act, because some other people at the top would have found a way to personally enrich themselves, like what happened with Benzoin Milikowski, or as you might know him, Benjamin Netanyahu, because first name, that's his real name, right? The one he did not choose to sound more ethnic, who most likely attempted to attack Iran, at least partly to gain favor for his re-election. Another time where something like that might have happened was when Bill Clinton invaded Iraq with invented evidence, where a contributing factor might have been his sexual scandal and allegations. But the most important takeaway to this video is that these governments will do literally and without question anything in order to maintain their and their elites' powers. The next time you vote in a country with legalized corruption, which is only legal because we call it something different, think about the following. Is this actually democratic? Do you really have a say in what your government does? Can you really trust that the personality that you're voting for will actually do anything, or will they be absorbed into the great, valueless slop of their party? Is voting the only kind of democratic engagement that is necessary for a better world?